Well, good afternoon. I'm Wendy Luget, the University Librarian, and it's wonderful to see so many admirers of Frederick Manfred here this afternoon. And before we begin, I want to extend my personal appreciation for Freya Manfred and Tom Pope for what a wonderful contribution to put together today's program. And you can imagine quite a feat to assemble the portfolio of readings and film clips that capture the essence of Manfred's amazing creative output. I also want to thank Jared Santek of the Loft Literary Center, who is our co-sponsor for this afternoon's event. Now, as many of you know, or I hope you know, the university libraries are actively engaged in support of the extraordinary writers in Minnesota, the exceptional literary community that we have here. We've been acquiring and preserving archives of Minnesota's literary legends, Frederick Manfred, Robert Bly, Trish Hampel, and many others. And we make those collections available to researchers the world over, and we put on programs like today to show the richness of the collection to the benefit of the campus and to the community. And you'll see that as the afternoon unfolds. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Cecily Marcus, who's the curator of those archives, the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. Cecily?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'd just like to add my thanks to Wendy's. Freya and Tom, you have been so involved with the development of this program, and it wouldn't have happened in this way without you. You might have first have known about Freya because of her illustrious father. And I would say that, just as an aside, the Manfred collection is one of my very favorites here in the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. It's one that I bring out to show students whenever I have the opportunity, students who think that writers write about what they know, not thinking that maybe they learn as they write, or they write about what they don't know so that they will have the opportunity to learn new things, and that quest is certainly evident in the Manfred collection, as are many other passions. Anyway, many of you know Freya because of her illustrious father. You may have first known her, but everyone recognizes that she is an important, wonderful poet in her own right. Her sixth collection of poetry, Swimming with the 100-Year-Old Snapping Turtle, won the 2009 Midwest Booksellers' Choice Award for Poetry. Her work has appeared in over 100 reviews and magazines and over 30 anthologies. Her memoir, Frederick Manfred, A Daughter Remembers, was nominated for a Minnesota Book Award and an Iowa Historical Society Award. Her father's dear friend, Robert Bly, said this about her work. What I like in her poems is that they are not floating around in the air or the intellect. The body takes them in. They are brave. Please join me in welcoming our Mistress of Ceremonies, Freya Manfred.
Thanks very much. Welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to see you and wonderful that you could come. I want to thank the University of Minnesota Libraries as well as the Loft for sponsoring this event, for getting together and unifying and making this event work. I also want to be sure to welcome all the writers here today, Robert Bly and Ruth Bly, Carol Connolly and Jim Lenfesti, Peter Campion, Tom Pope, John Calvin Rezmersky, and on film, we will see Bill Holm, as well as we'll meet the filmmakers Greg Winter and Mike Hazard, who have given us our films for today. Also, Rowan and Bly, our sons, Fred's grandsons, are here, and they are visual artists. So we're all here to celebrate this 100th birthday, and there are two colors of cake out there, white and chocolate, so there should be a lot of fun. Let me just take a quick second to talk about Mike Hazard for a minute, because this movie was showing before the event, and it will be shown again after the event, American Grizzly. And Mike actually also will have these films will be available at the table afterwards too. You can get them from Amazon too, and from libraries around town. This American Grizzly film, but Mike is a wonderful filmmaker. He's a poet too. He loves making documentaries with writers, and he's made documentaries with Thomas McGrath, the marvelous Thomas McGrath, the ever marvelous Robert Bly, Phoebe Hansen, and Eugene McCarthy, Roy McBride, and Jim Northrup and Han Shan, if I said that right. Mike says he's been touched by every book that Manfred has ever written. So that's Mike. Basically, the person who probably would have enjoyed this the most, I don't think he would have rolled over in his grave, I think he would have loved this event, would be my father. He was, especially because of the ice cream later, but he was born in a blizzard on January 6th in 1912, and his friend Robert Bly is going to begin today for us to invoke his presence, to invoke my father's presence. But I do want to mention about Robert, because you could go on like this for hours about Robert. They have similar roots, my father and Robert Bly. They were raised on farms, my father in Dune, Iowa, near Dune, Iowa, Robert near Madison, Minnesota. And Robert used to, my father used to visit Robert and his family there in Madison. Robert, as you probably know, has been invited to speak all over the world. He's internationally known, not only as a poet, which is enough as far as I'm concerned, but he's also known as a critic, an editor, a translator, an anthologist, and a social reformer. His latest book, he has so many. Silence in the Snowy Fields was the first that I loved so much. The morning poems I loved, where he wrote one every morning. Also, the latest, Talking into the Ear of a Donkey, is by far my favorite. I brought it with me. I keep it in the back of the car when Tom is talking too much, so I can just read it peacefully. And you can read the poems in Talking to the Ear of a Donkey over and over. They never get tired of them. They seem to be written by a newborn child and an ancient, long-lived sage at the same moment. They're new, fresh, alive, and full and kicking, but they're full of wisdom and caring and reassurance and understanding. So I'm very glad that he's agreed to come today to bring Dad's presence here. Robert, can you come up?
Well, intelligent-looking bunch of people out here. Better than when you come to see me. All right, so we'll read a couple of poems here, shall we? Better? Better? All right. I don't know what to read. You're keeping our small boat afloat. How many blessings have been given to us during the first distribution of light, that we are admired in 1,000 galaxies for our grief. Don't expect us to appreciate creation or to avoid mistakes. Each of us is a latecomer to the earth, picking up wood for the fire. Every night another beam of light slips out from the oyster's closed eye. So don't give up hope that the door of mercy may still be open. Seth and Shem tell me, are you still grieving over the spark of light that descended with no defender near into the Egypt of Mary's womb? Seth and Shem tell me, are you still grieving over that spark of light that descended with no defender near into the Egypt of Mary's womb? It's hard to grasp how much generosity is involved in letting us go on breathing when we contribute nothing valuable but our grief. Each of us deserves to be forgiven, if only for our persistence in keeping our small boat afloat when so many have gone down in the storm. So that's what it feels at my age, you know. Remember how many have gone down in the storm. Each of us deserves to be forgiven, if only for our persistence in keeping our small boat afloat when so many have gone down in the storm. All right, well, maybe one more here. What is sorrow for? It's a storehouse where we store wheat, barley, corn, and tears. We step to the door on a round stone, and the storehouse feeds all the birds of sorrow. And this storehouse feeds all the birds of sorrow. I say to myself, will you have sorrow at last? Go on, be cheerful in autumn. Be stoic, yes. Be tranquil, calm. Or in the valley of sorrows, spread your wings. When people are young, they think that, you know, you can only spread your wings when you're 22. Not enough sorrow yet. Just wait a while. What is sorrow for? It's a warehouse where we store wheat, barley, corn, and tears. We step to the door on a round stone, and the storehouse feeds all the birds of sorrow. And I say to myself, will you have sorrow at last? Go on. Be cheerful in autumn. Be tranquil, calm. Or in the valley of sorrows, spread your wings. That doesn't make any sense at all, but thank you.
Or in the valley of sorrow, spread your wings. My mother was married to my father for 34 years. What an accomplishment. And and then she also lived alone after they divorced for 34 years. Her name was Mariana Manfred. She was Slovak. Her people came from the river flats down here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Slovaks. And her contribution to his life can actually be seen in her early diaries that she kept and many letters that she kept from their early years together, which were handwritten letters. But I just want to read a couple of pages from a letter that my mother wrote a long time ago, back in September 19th of 1963, when it was written to a Minneapolis lawyer who had handled her mother's estate, my grandma Mary Shorba's estate. And at the time, my parents were losing their home in Laverne, the one that some of you have visited on Blue Mound, due to a problem with the contractor. He had not been able to build the house for the amount of money that my father and he had agreed on, but with only a handshake. Nothing written, of course. So Mother felt she was being overcharged. I'd love to read this 8-page letter. It has a cumulative power, but I'll just read a few little sentences. Starts out, dear sir, I was shocked at the bill I received from you, and I have been through some real shock and agony in the past 3 years, some of which I feel is quite relevant to this discussion and on which I shall now enlarge. And she goes on. Point 1, soon it will be 21 years that my husband and I have been married. In that period, we had an income one year of $8,500, of which $6,000 came from the McKnight Foundation, which considered Conquering Horse a manuscript worth sponsoring. Our annual gross income for the remaining years has been roughly $3,500. Our former neighbor, Dr. Northrop Beach, said that he recalled our living on a subsistence level, which startled me a little, as the phrase suggests misery, and we had many pleasant moments. We did manage to raise 3 exceptional children, and they wore hand-me-downs, didn't go to camps, and didn't go on vacations because we didn't. And then she goes on. She has a long list. We never owned a new car. We had no new suits. We had 1 coat. My mom had her 1 new coat. I had my 1 new coat, and so on. And it goes on and on. But I have found the Spartan life of a writer's family, coupled with his completely unpredictable income, she says, a tolerable one. And then she starts to talk a little bit about my father's background. Perhaps you are unaware, she says, that my father was almost dead. My husband. My husband was almost dead from tuberculosis and complications before I married him. His prognosis was death, and he was discharged only conditionally with the admonition that he should not work full-time. He also was told not to have children, by the way. I, too, was in the sanitarium for the same reason, with minimal lung involvement. But nevertheless, I've had 3 fine babies with the encouragement of their remarkable father, and I've maintained some kind of part-time work for half of our married years, anything I could find. And then finally, she reaches her final statement. She says, today, Fred has to his credit 14 books. He has brought pleasure and insight to thousands of readers. His friendship is a coveted gift. His example of integrity and and lone devotion to an ideal lends hope and energy to innumerable young as well as older people. His contribution is unquestionable to any thinking man. Finally, this is my only justification for laying myself out in this way, in this letter. Fred has been working actively within the framework of an ideal, and not primarily for profit, much as a minister does, and somewhat like you yourself have done, the lawyer. And indeed, he did work for, not always for profit, the lawyer. His way of life, Fred's way of life, bears many similarities to that of a clergyman, and I think he deserved somewhat the same privileges and immunities, although as yet, our society has not learned how direct a parallel exists between the motivation, purpose, and realization of the lives of the artists and the clergy. Mrs. Frederick F. Manfred, Blue Mound, Laverne, Minnesota. Bravo, Mom. My mother's letters are astonishing. Well, now we will have a 10 or 9-minute film of Dad, and in this film, he speaks for himself about how he became a writer. He's interviewed by a young man in high school named Heath Eden, whose mother is here today, Judy Stern, and she was a friend of Dad's. And Heath was a perfect audience for my father because he loved speaking to students he loved speaking to young people.
Mr. Manfred, it has been brought to my attention that you have had, or I should say are having, a very interesting life. But where did it start, and where did you grow up?
I don't know whether I have an interesting life or not. I think I got that ahead of me yet. But anyway, I was born on a farm near Doon, Iowa. That's D-O-O-N. Mm-hmm. It was named by a Scotsman after the poem written by Robert Burns called Bonnie Doon. Mm-hmm. I went to country school nearby till I was, 9 years old. And then my mother decided that since she was somewhat religious, in a good sense religious, that the schooling I was getting was a little too worldly, with quotes, you see. Mm-hmm. And the church had a school in town, a denominational school. So we moved nearer Doon so that we could then walk to school or ride to school, 3.5 miles away. Mm-hmm. And then I finished at the Doon Christian School. I was 12 years old when I finished 8th grade. I was 12 years old and I went to high school. And I went again to a denominational high school called Western Academy at Hull, Iowa. Mm-hmm. And I was 16 when I graduated from there. Stayed home 2 years, during which time my mother died. And then at 18, I caught a ride. I had $50. My dad gave me $50 and I went off to college. And then with $50, I went through college. I worked my way through. All along, though, I was writing. My Aunt Catherine was living with me before I started school. Or my folks rather. She was teaching in a school about a quarter of a mile away, so she boarded with us.
Mm-hmm.
She went to college. She went to Teachers College at Cedar Falls, Iowa. And but my father only went to the 3rd grade, and we only recently figured out that he probably had dyslexia. He was smart enough, but he couldn't read or write. So I had a father who couldn't read or write.
I wonder, where did you get your, living on the farm, where did you get your first interest in writing?
Well, from Aunt Catherine, because she had on the she had a volume of poetry published, and that was called Poems by Catherine Fikema. That was my family name, Fikema, and that was on our parlor table. So I grew up in a house where there was somebody had written a book, and that's terribly important. You know, that little image of that book. Mm-hmm. She started to read Mother Goose Tales to me and Anderson's tales, and before I started school, and I was watching her eyes were hitting the page, and pretty soon I could read from the page before I started school, and I became a reader, and it wasn't long before I decided that probably the most wonderful thing in the world to become would be somebody who could also write stories like these people had written for me. That's my way of repaying them back. Mm-hmm. And then I started writing poetry in grade school, and I wrote poetry in high school. I also started writing stories. My father didn't like that business, though. He had hoped that I'd become a farmer, like he was. And so he frowned about this business of reading. Mm-hmm. And much like I have, that book, Green Earth, by the way, is somewhat autobiographical. And I have some of that in there. Mm-hmm. It isn't totally autobiographical. See, it's about 50-50. But I have some of that in there. So I had to hide my writing, and I found a place in the haymow behind where the alfalfa was stacked. There was a little skylight up on the roof, and there I wrote, in longhand, I wrote stories. And then Saturday afternoon, instead of going to catechism, he can't listen, that's right, he's gone, so he can't hear this. I would go instead to the Great Northern Depot where I knew there was a typewriter, and that guy liked me, and he let me use the typewriter, and I typed up the stories then. Mm-hmm. And I'd send them off, and of course get rejection slips. This is even when I was 13, 14 years old, I was sending them off, you know, to Collier's, Liberty, Harper's, you know.
So, and you learned from your aunt.
And then my aunt.
You mentioned the name Fikema. What is your full name?
Now it is Frederick Manfred. I was baptized Frederick Fikema.
Okay.
And then later on I added Manfred because people mispronounce Fikema.
That is why you changed?
Yeah. Excellent. I got tired of continually having to spell it, and then the mispronunciation just irritated my ear or something terrible. They called me Fikema, and I hated that word.
When you went on to college in the city, did you like the new life, or did you find the more pressurized stuff?
Well, when you're young, you know, you really don't have any opinions about that. Especially, you know, I'm always curious about everything, so it was, you know, terribly interesting to me to see city life. As time went on, though, it became pretty obvious that much later on that I really didn't care for the city. Mm-hmm. And although I had some great times here in Minneapolis when I finally got a job with the Minneapolis Journal, I lived near the university, and I usually either walked to work or took the streetcar, and that was fun. In those days, Minneapolis was rather wonderful to be in because it was simple, it wasn't very large, 250,000 people, and there were farms on 50th Street across Minnehaha Creek. South of that, there was almost all farms in those days. Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to move to Laverne, Minnesota?
Well, then I'd be near my where I was born and raised.
Out of my control. I thought it was a little longer. He had a wonderful thing he said towards the end of the part you cut about Scarlet Plume and the Native American people. And he was asked, you know, what he thought about the situation, and he was very, very eloquent about his, about how they were, as he put it, screwed. Okay. So now, that's my part of this event. I want to read a few little things. Because obviously I probably could have told stories all afternoon about my father, stories I haven't told my husband, stories my sons haven't probably ever heard, long, long stories, short stories, and none of us none of us readers today knew him fully. I certainly didn't know him fully. And there are probably people in this audience today, I've already seen some of them briefly, who could tell us even more wonderful stories that we're not going to hear up here. But I hope I can see you afterwards. I hope I can talk with you afterwards when we're having some food. So since there's so much to say, I just want to read a few letters that my father wrote me, and maybe one excerpt from This Is the Year, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and also a couple of poems that I wrote about my father after his death. These letters that are in my memoir about my dad were written to me over many years, particularly when I was away from home, going to college, going to grad school, and I would write him and he would write me back. He would write me when I didn't write him too. And this is an April 5th, 1967 letter he wrote to me because I had written to him saying that I wished that he were a little more well-known, that I knew how much more he wanted to be well-known, or as Tom was saying in the car on the way in, he wanted to be famous. And I think a lot of writers want to be famous, just a little part of us. But at any rate, he wrote this to me April 5th, 1967. Oh, Freya, I'm not so sure I want to be famous. It would be nice to know I was famous, I suppose, just about an hour before I was to die. But before that, I don't know, an awful lot of fuss and a lot of putting on of a friendly face when you don't care to. I do this already far too much with the little fame I now have. All I ever wanted was enough money to live simply so that I could get out the work, capital T, capital W, the work. I love creating. I can be completely myself, naked or clothed or whatever, and never have to concern myself with how my face looks as long as I write. It's like being a song, let alone writing, creating it. It's like being a bird, let alone imitating one. It's all out, go, rise, 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 get up off the ground, give, give, give. Out go, inward fountaining and outward flowing. Oh, marvelous. And then briefly, he wrote a letter to me about dreams. I was telling him about dreams and how important they were to me, and he wrote me a quick letter about how important they were to him. He said, cultivate your dreams and your nightmares. They're often the best part of your life. It's a sign, if your private dreamer will give you this, of being a creative person to be able to remember those dreams afterwards. Most dead people alive today can't remember their dreams. Because their dreamer knows they're not worthy of knowing about them. What I do if a nightmare wakes me in the middle of the night, or a dream, is I hoist myself up on my pillow a little, not too high, because then the dreamer in you becomes alarmed, you're paying too much attention. And I relive the dream or the nightmare. I am become thoroughly scared or moved or whatever by it. And with a little sideways smile, I enjoy it too. Nor must one take on a superior air about such dreams. The sideways smile must be mostly serious. If one allows one's dreamer to have the freedom to dream anything it or he or she wants, and then is circumspect and polite when it or he or she offers them to you for you to look at, you will dream more and more out loud, so to speak. And the more you do this, the tougher and healthier you'll be all your life. And I think that's so true. I partly decided to get married based on a dream. And I certainly decided to have children based on a dream, because that's what the dream said. So then this last little letter I want to read to you is prefaced by the fact that, well, I'll just read it. It's in 1970, a few years later. Dear Freya, I don't know if he maybe even got this idea from you, Robert, because didn't you used to talk about leapers, people who leap? I think he might have picked up on this idea of yours. He said, "Dear Freya, there are probably some 5 million natural-born brilliant people at any given time in our present society, and every one of them, without working too much at it, can present brilliant things. It's easy to be brilliant and to seem brilliant if you're born brilliant. But it is another matter for a brilliant person to come through with something simple and moving and profound. It's the difference between an Einstein and a complicated-sounding professor of mathematics. It's the mental leaps, the jumps that count. Intuitive making beyond learning. It's not the reasoned out things. In fact, I can't think of a single new idea that ever has been arrived at by sheer rational thinking. It's true, a good mind has to be exposed to rational thinking around it for it to make some of these jumps, but nevertheless, it's still the jumpers who make it go. And the curious thing is, once you become a jumper, you can hardly go back to being just a rational person." Love, Dad. I'm sure you all, many of you know exactly what he's talking about. I would like to read a brief little excerpt from This Is the Year. Also, I have it prefaced in my memoir by an incident that happened with my father, and I just think I'll go ahead with that. He had a CAT scan, and he was very claustrophobic, and so he hated them. So I'm going to preface this slightly. He talked to me about it. He had cancer at the time, and he was going to be dead within 6 weeks. But he said, "You know, Freya, I barely got through my last scan." "Well, what happened?" "Oh, I had to wait 2 hours to get in. I knew ahead of time I'd feel claustrophobic once they stuck me in that tunnel, so it was sheer torture to sit in that hallway expecting the worst. But I didn't ask for a tranquilizer because I have trouble driving home when I have those." "Well, how did you get through it?" "Oh, I don't know. This young guy came in. He took down some notes about me, and he treated me like I was some old farmer. Just because I wasn't wearing my good pants. And because I'm an older fellow, I suppose, and that's how some people treat older citizens." "Talking down to you?" "Exactly. So at one point I said, 'Look here, I'm Frederick Manfred. I've written more than 25 novels, a lot more than most people have ever done, so you better talk kindly to me, man to man, or I'm leaving right now.'" Well, what did he say to that? Oh, it was hilarious, really, and sad. He went in and told the nurses I was suffering from delusions. And I mistakenly thought I was a famous author who'd written all kinds of books. Oh, no. Yes, and one of the nurses peeked out at me for a minute and smiled to herself and went back in and told him I was a famous author. Well, then, how did he behave toward you then? Oh, I don't know. I never saw him again. After that, the smiling nurse took a few more notes, and we got along fine. So every moment, Freya, was sheer hell. I like big open spaces, you know, but by God, I made it through. And here's his quote from This Is the Year. "Pierre is the main character. Pierre turned away from the brooding hills. He himself preferred the prairie lying to the east. He looked at it. He whistled. Once again, it reminded him of an ocean. It rolled away in slow, gigantic waves, broadly undulating with vast troughs running through them, from north to south, as if only yesterday a storm had raged on it, and only now it was settling and calming, waves sliding into scooped-out dells, and smooth, round-top hummocks replacing gray-edged, slapping crests. Over all of it, riding the undulations like an anchored convoys, floated separate farmyards, a red barn, a white frame house, a fading gray cattle shed, weathered outbuildings, and a budding windbreak grove of ash and maple and willow. Some farms rode the seas within call of each other, and some almost out of sight. He loved the land." That's Pierre. And I have a couple of poems which I wrote after my father died. This is one where I was walking around in his place in Roundwind, and I saw his tree that he planted, green pear tree. Green pear tree in September. On a hill overlooking the Rock River, my father's pear tree shimmers in perfect peace. covered with hundreds of ripe pears, with pert tops, plump bottoms, and long curved leaves, until the green haloed tree rose up and sang hello. I had forgotten. He planted it 12 years ago when he was 73, so that in September he could stroll down with the sound of the crickets rising and falling around him and stand naked to the waist, slightly bent, sucking juice from a ripe pear. And another poem I wrote after he passed away had to do with dreams I began having about him. It was a dream that he came to me in a dream. It's called When My Dead Father Visits. When my dead father visits, he speaks in a voice as familiar as the clear stream below my childhood home. Sometimes a woman accompanies him with 2 children, a boy and a girl. Sometimes he drives an ancient car and finds his way better than I can through labyrinthic city streets. When I ask what it's like to be dead, he cries, "What do you mean dead? I'm very much alive, busy all day long." Sometimes I tell my children about their grandfather's visits. I tell them my dreams, deeper than memory. I tell them I'm grateful to talk with the dead one who is not dead. Because of him, I've come to love the living more. Thanks. And now I'm going to introduce one of the living that I love. Thomas Pope he's worked for 25 years he did work for 25 years as a professional screenwriter. He's worked for Penny Marshall and Francis Coppola and Ridley Scott and Barry Levinson, Frank Oz, Robert Redford, among others. He's worked on FX and Someone to Watch Over Me movies, Lords of Discipline, Hammett, The Curious Life of Benjamin Button, and then more lately, the Sweetland movie, Sweetland with Ali Salim. He is now an associate professor at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design and the father of Rowan and Bly Pope, not to mention, as I said, my husband. He knew Dad well. Dad was delighted to know Tom. He even liked him even after Tom beat him arm wrestling. You rascal. How did you beat him arm wrestling, by the way?
I was stronger than he was. I was young and he was old.
Oh, I don't, okay. You had a higher fulcrum. Are you going to...
After I beat him arm wrestling, it's true, I did beat him. He was 60 and I was 30. There was and he said, "Well, you beat me, but if I was younger, I'd have beat you." I was honored and very lucky to be Fred Manfred's son-in-law. Being a son-in-law is a little like being a professional spy. You're admitted into the most intimate life of a family, and yet it's not your family. You're told things and shown things, and yet they're not yours to hear or see. But it works. Soon, and to your surprise, you find yourself becoming a part of that adopted family, sharing their secrets, their hopes, and their dreams. Of course, Fred made all of that much easier, since he adopted not just me, but in fact the whole world into his family. Fred did that by saying anything that came into his mind, from the darkest fears to his greatest dreams. A fleeting and even childish thought would often be followed by some profound philosophy. The highest artistic aspiration followed by despair at another season of watching the Chicago Cubs lose again. He was a man without filters, who never censored himself, and said embarrassing things that weren't meant to embarrass, and so they didn't. Confidences that weren't meant to expose, and so they didn't. Did he have a crush on a girl? Fred would tell you. Did he wonder whether he should bow to the King of Sweden when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature? Fred had an opinion on that one too. He wouldn't bow. Fred let her rip, not just because he couldn't help himself, but because life is short, and a hell of a lot of fun, and why even think about stepping on the brakes? Fred Manfred was that most original and unique of men, and the kind I admire most in the world, the self-invented man. A farm boy who quit the farm, a child of a strict religion which he abandoned. He was 6'9" tall and saw the world as if from a great height, but also up close and personal. When he was informed he was certain to die of tuberculosis, he became his own doctor and invented his own diet, which saved his life. And in defeating death, he learned to embrace life. But his personal reinvention only began with his enthusiasm. He was raised without art and yet became an artist. He was the son of an illiterate farmer and yet transformed himself into a man of letters. Fred was told all of his life to be one thing or another, to be a farmer, a communist, a safe rider, and most of all, for God's sake, to tone it down. Yet he resolutely and at great cost, but also at great pleasure, went his own way. He grew up in a culture that didn't trust too much education, and so he became his own university. He was a child of a world where emotions were repressed and censored, and so he became as famous for his passions as for his poetry. When he was a boy, everyone told him that he would grow up to be a small-town farmer, and so he became a citizen of the world. Where others find the ecstatic and run from it, he embraced it. Where others flee from joy, he dove right in. For all of these choices, Fred paid a price. I don't mean simply the price of living at a near poverty level. To Fred, money was trivial, a gift, I think, of his poor roots. Nor did he mind being scorned by the East Coast intelligentsia who refused to acknowledge his extraordinary work to capture the heart and culture of the upper Midwest, an effort only matched by Mark Twain and Faulkner. Oh, Fred wanted the fame, knew he deserved it, and hoped that after his death he would be acclaimed as he was not acclaimed in life. But he wouldn't compromise his art and paid the price. We all want to make a big splash with our lives, and Fred wanted to make his splash into a cannonball. And when the fame he wanted eluded him, he grew wistful, and who can blame him? Fred also paid a price as he labored gloriously to achieve his magnificent dream of becoming a world-class author, the chronicler of his age and his region. The price he paid was that he had to look inside himself and to shut out those parts of the world which got in the way of his vision. He put on blinders in order to see the world more clearly. He paid the price of taking from his past what he needed to survive. From his farm roots, he took a work ethic that had him working on and, yes, finishing his last novel just 6 weeks before he died. From the Calvinism whose dogmas he rejected, he gained a moral rectitude that gave structure and guidance to his life. From his giant size, he gained a sense that he was larger than life, but also a certain insecurity and even alienation that imbued his work with a tremendous compassion. Did he pay too much for all he gained? I think it was a bargain. Part of what made Fred special was that he never entirely left his roots behind. Born into a family of 5 brothers, he fathered 3 children who magnified his life. He grew up in a progressive tradition that said all men were their brother's keeper, a tradition he maintained so that even as his farm friends grew more conservative, he grew more liberal. Nor could he ever entirely grow past the shock of losing his mother when he was 17, a loss which kept him, or at least a part of him, forever a teenager, with many of the passions of youth, but also its limitations. He loved women, but from a distance, like the love-struck teenager that still lived inside him, and shied away from the second marriage he could have found if only he could just get past his fear that dreaming of love was better, or at least safer, than the ups and downs of the real thing. At times, and as he grew older, he became increasingly his own biographer, disguising his own life in his art. But for Fred, all of that was a ripple on a larger lake. His vision of writing, of being a true man of letters, dedicated to his art and craft, made all the rest of it, the good and the bad, the missed opportunities and the nearly missed mortgage payments, seem all worthwhile. And it was. Thank you. We have a film now. Oh, yes, and now I am. Oh, I get to introduce my wife, who will introduce my sons.
By the way, I forgot to mention that Robert Bly, when my father passed away in 1994, wrote a wonderful article about him for the Minneapolis Tribune, which I felt summarized who he was absolutely beautifully, and we have copies of it here for everyone today if you'd like a copy. They're out by the door as you leave and as you came in. Here's a little note my father wrote to me in 1986 when our sons were 6 years old, our twin sons. Dear Freya and Tom and boys, those boys are sweethearts. It's good to see that they're growing up quite strong-minded and at the same time considerate. That's the whole secret of good upbringing, that one grows up with a strong ego that other people love. It takes quite some expert sailing between all sorts of dangerous shoals to get a child into manhood or womanhood safely. You're both doing a hell of a job, Dad, which was nice of him to say, because I hadn't heard that. And here's a little bit more about our sons, Rowan and Bly. They are professional visual artists, and they have their Bachelor of Arts degrees from Stanford, where they majored in psychology and art, and in Bly's case, also biology, and a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Minnesota, which is a 3-year program. Their work has been shown and awarded in numerous exhibitions, and it has been purchased by the Museum of Fine Art in Armenia. They have taught drawing and painting, graphic novel illustration throughout Minnesota for several years, including at the University of Minnesota and Perpich Center for Arts Education, young kids, older kids, all ages. In March, Bly's drawing of my mother, Mariana, will be shown for a year in the National Portrait Exhibition at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. The jury selected 50 out of 3,000 drawings. And Rowan's drawing, Franz Kafka's The Trial, as Rowan loves Franz Kafka, won second prize in the 2012 Manifest International Drawing Annual. That's a booklet that's internationally distributed. So here are Rowan and Bly Pope, Bly and Rowan Pope.
I'm Rowan, and this is Bly. We're going to be reading a short excerpt from my mom's great book, Frederick Manfred, A Daughter Remembers. And this is sort of a list of rules for young writers. If you can hear me. A writer who nearly dies from, this is my mom's writing, a writer who nearly dies from tuberculosis when he's in his 20s and spends 2 years in a tuberculosis sanatorium where he watches a succession of 13 roommates die, has to develop a strong and keep strong habits to get his writing done. Here are a few of my father's rules.
Rule number 1, don't party or drink alcohol on weeknights. Your work will suffer the next day. And he writes a letter to Mom, 1968. I personally do frown on the use of any narcotics, drugs, etc., unless medically prescribed. There is just no excuse, none at all, for any use of pot, nicotine, LSD, the like, and only goddamn fools indulge in it. Liquor there might be some excuse for, as it has food value. The others have no value of any kind, and they probably damage one. In my house, there will be never any pot parties, and I don't like it when anyone smokes in it. Copulation, yes. Swearing, yes. Truth-telling, yes. Hearing voices, yes. Loud smacking over food, my God, yes. Burping, maybe. Cries of joy, oh dear sweet father, yes. Dad.
Number 2, resist visitors on weekdays, except Friday. Talk is great fun, but it takes energy, which must be saved for writing.
Rule number 3, stop writing after 3 hours, or sooner if you get tired, so you'll have something left for the next day.
Number 4, nap every day.
Number 5, answer letters and do errands on Saturday.
6, rest on Sunday. This means no church except the great outdoors, lots of sleep, the Sunday paper, waffles or pancakes, and maybe a visit with a friend.
Rule number 7, keep your meals simple. Cereal for breakfast, a slice of bread and an apple for lunch, a slab of meat, and some vegetables for dinner. After dinner, try ice cream. Or bread with jam piled on it an inch thick. Candy's okay on Sundays, but you better cash in it at some high place only you can reach, or one of your kids will ferret it out and eat it.
Number 8, keep your weight down. It's better for your knees, and besides, your body is the greatest miracle you'll ever possess.
Exercise every day. Walk or use a ski machine, dig a garden, clean house, keep moving.
10, don't keep a dog or a cat. Dogs demand too much attention, and cats belong in barns where they can catch mice. If the neighbor's cat comes over to eat your mice, that's a gift. It's a pleasure to watch a good mouser work, and maybe have her sit in your lap too, if you're outside reading in the sun.
Rule number 11, don't get into an argument with a close relative. If someone starts up, it's best to fall silent.
12, there's no king or queen worth crossing the street to see. Writers and thinkers are the true aristocracy.
Rule 13, find time to be quiet and alone.
And the most important thing on Dad's list, don't whine about how hard it is to write. Several of my talented friends were the children of well-known authors who grumbled and complained endlessly about the tribulations of writing. As a consequence, my friends made up their minds never to write a word themselves. But Dad never complained about how hard writing was. He left for work excited. He returned tired but happy. Writing was a gift and a blessing, and he was lucky.
And this is a quote from Boy Almighty that Mom writes at the end of the list of rules. Each day was a gift. Each day came wrapped in sparkling morning sunlight. For most people, days are all alike. They forget that they are presents from the unknown. But Eric knew that they were gifts, all of them. One by one they came, and he knew they would not come again. That this day he was having, this one short spurt of time, this one was the last of its kind. That once it vanished into evening's melancholy sunfall, it was gone forever. He caressed them and called them each a name. This one, this day, he called a golden drop. This next one, this day, he called a water drop. The next one, this day, he called a golden drop. They were all new and different names they were, because when a day died at sunfall, he forgot it sleeping. And waking, he found a new one and named it the best name he knew, a golden drop, a water drop.
And that was from Boy Almighty. I just wrote this last night. I just wanted to share a few memories of my grandfather. They're mostly from my childhood. I only knew him till I was about 14 or so. So they're maybe sort of vague memories. But I didn't have many one-on-one conversations with my grandfather since I was more interested in hanging out and having fun with my brother when we made a visit to his house in Laverne. But my impression of my grandfather was that he was a very happy, genuine, and passionate person. Someone you really wanted to be around, a picker-upper, a positive person. He really seemed to love people and not in any sort of phony political way. I remember his excited smile when we came to visit, and I remember his seemingly endless nighttime conversations with my parents in front of the fire. I remember wondering how adults could possibly talk so long about anything. I think perhaps the thing I remember best about my grandfather was his voice, sort of a low, deep, confident voice in the background, a voice that always gave me a kind of unconscious comfort and sense of safety. A few memories I have of him are of playing basketball with him in his backyard. One time we interrupted a basketball game to compare our grandfather's height with the height of our uncle. They were both around 6'9". Even at my young age, I could tell that my grandpa and uncle were taking the measurement very seriously, and that what they really wanted was to be taller than the other. Something else I remember was that every time we came to visit our grandfather, Bly and I climbed onto the roof of his house, of his stone house that he built himself, which we weren't, this was after Blue Mound, which we weren't really allowed to do. It was pretty high up, maybe 20 feet off the ground in some places. I don't think my parents ever knew that we climbed on top of the roof every time we made a visit, since we usually did that when you guys were sleeping. Another memory I have is walking down the hill beside his house and picking crab apples with my grandfather from the crab apple trees he planted, and that's one of my favorite memories. I have a couple of memories, just two memories I wanted to share. One of them was actually sparked by Rowan's memory about the endless nighttime conversations that they had. And I remember kind of sitting and listening to these conversations, not really knowing what they were about, but I recorded how long each person was talking. And it was Dad, Mom, and Paka, Frederick Manfred, and I think it was just those three people. I think maybe someone else, but I calculated that Paka talked 85% of the time, and everyone else was talking maybe 15 at most. Another memory I have of Paka is when we were like 6 or 7 or really young kids. We would crawl. He would sit in a chair with his legs spread out and his feet planted on the floor, so his whole body was stretched out like a ladder almost, and we would climb up over his shoulders and slide down his body, and it was like this long slide, and we would do it over and over and over again when we were 6 or 7 or so. Yeah, so we just wanted to wish him a happy birthday, happy 100th birthday.
Thank you, guys. It was wonderful. Here is a film clip of Fred from a show that was called Portrait on KTCA. I think he was 80 years old when this was done. Yeah. He was 80, which is interviewed by Freya. So we have a brief clip of him talking about writing and about tone. Someone have the lights?
Have you any sense of why do you write?
Well, that wonderful phrase during the Second World War, Kilroy was here. I've been here. Look what I saw. Wow, it was worthwhile. Let's put this down. Later on, somebody may want to know about this, because I know when I read someone else's Kilroys were here, I enjoy that, see? And it really goes back, though, to dear Aunt Catherine. You remember her, this austere, aesthetic, tall, skinny woman who finally had a stillborn child when he's getting into her 40s. Still was the one who was my father's sister. He only went to the 3rd grade because he was dyslexic, but she went to college. And she was my very first teacher. And before I really started school with her, a number of things happened. One was she used to read Mother Goose rhymes and so on, and because I watched where her eyes was falling on the page, I learned to read from watching where her eyes were falling. And another time she took me to the northwest corner of the Grove. There was something going on in the house I wasn't supposed to hear. I had figured that out already as a boy, but I didn't care. And she's sitting there in the grass tatting, you know, and it's kind of a form of embroidery, like a silver fish back and forth, you know. And she watches me follow an ant out of an ant hole and go up the side of the tree and come down with something in its mandible and goes into the ground. And she shakes her head and she said, I wonder what's ever going to become of you. She said, any other kid I'd had here, she said, you would have been quarreling and crying and let me go to see Mommy and you can amuse yourself. I wonder what's going to become of you. So I finally said, well, what's the best thing to be? And she said, well, I'd rather be a poet than a president. That has haunted me for the rest of my life. And truly, who was present when Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey? Who was present when Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, and so on and so forth? You see, if you write a very good play or a very good novel or a very good poem, it has a chance to last the human forever. Whereas political systems, philosophical systems, religious systems come and go and vanish. But the only thing that lasts is a form of art, really well done. I think that was always a deep challenge to me. I probably won't make it in that sense, but I love to think about it.
What do you mean you won't make it?
Well, maybe I'm not good enough. I have to think about that too. There's not the biggest stumbling block a writer can have, or anybody in any field, any of the arts field, for architecture, painting, and sculpture, and so on, is to think that you're really pretty good. You should always think that perhaps you're not good enough. there's a joy trying to overcome that and do better, you know. And you're not really looking for compliments, because the work itself is important.
But what about the other side? Isn't there a moment when you have the other side too? The
enjoyment of it? I mean, where I get some kudos or praise and so on. Yeah, but that only lasts one day, and then the next day there's another problem up on your desk, and so then you forget about the praise. And I get uncomfortable, generally speaking, around praise. Unless it's a very beautiful woman. That's different. Then I enjoy that. But
well, what if the critics missed about your work, or other people? Do you feel?
Well, Wallace Stegner says that in his books, it's like the 4th of July. Everybody's there. But he also made the following remark, that there really wasn't too much depth in all that. Wallace Stegner isn't catching on. He's missing tone that you and I talked about earlier. I might mention that. When I was a very little boy, someone told me that those wires between telephone poles was carrying voices. That's when we first had our telephone. See, I was born in a place, no telephones, no radio, no TV, no records or nothing. It was just plain country living. Then the telephone came in, and that was a miracle to me that voices would go over a wire. So I used to run to the telephone poles and stick my ear against it and see if I could. I heard a buzzing and a humming, but I couldn't hear any voices. Then I went to trees to listen to trees, and I learned that the bigger the tree and the harder the wind, the more they start to talk. It's only recently, when I was up in the Northwoods some years ago, and just before I wrote Milk of Wolves, that those great red pines and great white pines have symphonies in them. And it's not unlike the whales making symphonies in the ocean. Very similar to that sound. So since then, when I want to hear somebody or listen to my own things, I keep waiting for my tone to show up. If you sit alone long enough, you hear your own tone after a while. Mm-hmm. I don't mean heart beating or sound of breathing, something else, tone. And
what is your tone?
Well, actually, I've been trying to capture it and get into my writing, and I hope it shows up in there somewhere.
Is it better not to know your tone?
I don't want to really know too much about it, except that I know it's there, and I sort of vaguely hear it, and I know it's when it's coming off my fingertips on the typewriter or by my pen. Like I told you about this friend of mine, a young woman poet. I knew her socially. I knew her in her clothes. And that was always interesting, and she was lively. Her letters were fun. But then I finally read all her poems sitting down one night, and there suddenly something besides the really fine lines in the poetry and so on, suddenly the tone of her, the Eve of her started to show up in it, which I hadn't noticed before. The real woman, the old Eve come in there, see? That's what I mean by tone. And if you read me, you should hear the old Adam in me. Or the first,
But tone is not just old Eve and old Adam, or is it?
It's deeper than that. It's the sound. Maybe it's the sound of eternity trying to speak. Or the original echoes of the Big Bang. They found that, that throughout the universe there's a certain sound that's even everywhere. No matter what way they send their telescopes and their radio telescopes, they find it exactly the same everywhere in the universe, which is the remnant of the explosion of the Big Bang.
And you as an artist are picking up on...
I'm hoping that it's being expressed through me, and you too. I think it's coming through you too when you write. Mm-hmm. And we're talking deep stuff here.
Well, this James P. Lenfesti is the person I'm introducing next. I'm so thankful that these writers came today to help read some of Dad's works. Jim had a career in academia, which I didn't know. James P. Lenfesti, excuse me. Advertising and journalism as an editorial writer at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. In fact, there was recently a column by Jim there. He won several Page One awards for excellence. And he's also published poetry, reviews, and articles, and a book of personal essays. He has 4 poetry collections: A Cartload of Scrolls, 100 Poems in the Manner of Tang Dynasty poet Han Shan from Holy Cow Press, and Into the Goodhue County Jail, Poems to Free Prisoners from Red Dragonfly Press. He also edited a book called Low Down and Coming On, a feast of delicious and dangerous poems about pigs. And he co-edited a collection of essays, a Robert Bly, In This World, the University of Minnesota Press, with Thomas R. Smith. He chairs the Literary Witness poetry program in Minneapolis, the most marvelous program. So here's James P. Lenfesti.
Thank you. A couple of short anecdotes and 2 short readings. The anecdote from my academic days is I was a young English instructor at River Falls when I was a boy. And I ended up founding one of the first courses in the United States on American Indian literature, and I'd read everything that American Indians wrote that I could find. But I also said, I need to find who else is writing about Native people, and that's when I turned up Fred Manfred, Scarlet Plume and Conquering Horse, because I never met him in person, but that's how I first met him. Here's the second way I met him. It was through Mike Hazard, and Mike Hazard's wonderful film, which we've seen before, and you'll see after. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But Mike sent around a postcard advertising that film, and it included this piece that is in Robert's, a piece of a poem that is in Robert's article about him. And I've had that little postcard on my mirror facing me for, what is it, Mike, 25 years? When did you first do that film? And it still is a challenge to me, and it's a challenge to you, and I'm going to give it to you. It's from a book called Winter Count, Thorpe Springs Press, 1965. The poem is The Old Black Silence. It has 6 verses, and I'm going to do 3 of them. I'm going to leave out the narrative verse, but the boy at the end, it's his uncle talking to young Fred. Boy, I didn't know it was going to be like this. Nothing but pain, pain, and more pain. Boy, I didn't know my life was going to end like this. All of it ending in an eating pain, my leg rotting and me losing it when I like to walk and look for wildflowers, my lungs rotting and me choking when I like meadow air and far wandering towers, my brains rotting and my mind wandering when I like swift thoughts and lively talk, my bowels rotting and me losing control when I like clean sheets and white chalk. Boy, I never dreamed my life would end like this. Oh, that it has come to this, an invalid on one leg, rotting away in terrible pain, having to beg, me beg, for pills to kill this eating pain. Boy, my childhood, it was all a lie, a lie. Boy, it meant nothing, nothing, not a thing. What is life? I've had time to think about it some since they told me I had cancer. It is a sunflower for a season. It is a blossom for a tall, blazing star on the prairie. It is the spark of a firefly in the night. It is the cactus flower in the desert. It is the breath of a horse on a frosty morning. It is the shadow that steals across the lawn at sunset. It is a germ in the spring and a hull in the fall. It is here today and gone tomorrow. Boy, it's all going to be gone for me, Fred. Yes, I see, Uncle, I said. Were it not for galaxy suns and their gaseous using the night dark ancient of ancients would drift through again, diffusing. And this for all of us. What about you, boy? Is your work coming along? Are you still making candles against darkness and wrong? The whole thing is to blast. Blast and blast again, to fill the black with songs, poems, temples, paintings, anything at all. Attack, attack. Open up and let go, even if it's only blowing, but blast. And I say this loving my God, because we are all he has at last. So what about it? So what about it, boy? Is your work going well? Are you still lighting lamps against darkness and hell? Boy. And that's not a joke. That still haunts me. That's still a challenge every morning. So John Rosmerski put together a wonderful book that's sort of a Fred Manfred condensed Bible here. And I just love it. And he has many, many wonderful little ways he describes it. And this is a passage that he called Love Poet, and from Green Earth. And I just selected a few things because he talked about tone. And here's what I think he's partly referring about tone. I love that image of the vibrations of the universe and the inner Adam and the inner Eve. That's beautiful. But also it's sound. It's a tone is a sound. And he has a marvelous ear. You heard Robert reading a passage, and we'll hear many more passages when you hear the tone. So here's this. He passed under the double row of tall young cottonwoods. They formed a precise corridor with a sidewalk going exactly down the center of it. Their tough leaves had just turned yellow. The sun was almost down at the far end of the street ahead, and its light bloomed on the undersides of the cottonwood leaves. The yellow light fell upon him in its little rains of gold. It even made the sidewalk gold. There was a vague tint of pink in the yellow light, and it gave his swinging hands a healthy glow. The sound of the clittering leaves in the easy evening breeze was like the accidental chords of leather wind chimes. Did you get that sentence? Wasn't that fantastic? Clittering. He was aware of walking down an avenue of beauty. It was as if he'd walked in on a sonnet of Shakespeare. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where last the sweet birds sang. He sauntered slowly along. He seemed to be wading into a golden moment of some kind. A judgment day was flowering around him. Some glorious revelation was about to dawn upon him. Wondering in a daze, he looked up to see what was about to happen. Ada. A wonderful name for a girl, even if it was the same as his mother's, and maybe for that reason the more so. They walk a little more. He looked at her boarding house. It was a one-story bungalow, painted a soft yellow with white trim windows. The roof was blue. The blinds on the street side were drawn. Rhymed words rose to mind as he continued on to his own house. That special face in a new place. Blue eyes, cottonwood leaves, blue skies, oat sheaves. Ada of old Atlantis, Ada come to haunt us. The words didn't make much sense, but they belled in his head like a lovely set of wind chimes.
Our next reader is Carol Connolly, the St. Paul Poet Laureate, and the author of All This and More from Noden Press. Her first book was Payments Due, and Payments Due, On Stage, Off Stage, Midwest Village and Voices, but it's now in its 5th printing. It was the first produced for the stage in LA and then in Minneapolis, and it ran 2 years in each locale. Carol Connolly, curates a monthly series of readings by writers. It's now in its 14th year to benefit Public Art St. Paul. And she is also the recipient of the 2011 K. Sexton Award, presented annually by the Minnesota Book Awards to an individual or organization. I think Carol's more of an organization. In recognition of long-standing dedication and outstanding work in fostering books, reading, and literary activity in Minnesota. Connolly, Carol, is a St. Paul native, and she has 8 children, 11 perfect grandchildren, and 1 perfect great-grandchild.
Thank you, Freya. My next book is going to be Payments Overdue. I chose a story also from Mr. Rizmersky's beautiful Frederick Manfred reader. And in the foreword, Mr. Manfred writes, the foreword to this story, I wanted to do something about the Sioux uprising in Minnesota, a piece of our history that had vanished because the Civil War was afoot at the time. One day I came upon a letter General Sibley wrote to his wife in which he refers in scathing tones to a young lady they both knew who preferred to go with her Indian lover into the wilds rather than go back to her husband and child who were waiting for her. Frederick says, women are far more practical than men. When the chips are down, the girls choose the right course for survival, not the course, say, of intellectual truth, but the course of a living truth, survival truth. He was also thinking about this by the time, he also says, I was thinking about this by this time, that why didn't I just put this book in the woman's mind? I had never done that before, and then see what I come up with. That's a real challenge, and Frederick Manfred did just that, and the book was the story was The Scarlet Plume. This starts mid-story, and it's not real long, so don't be nervous. Mid-story, there is an altercation in the Yankton Indian camp. Judith, our heroine, knows she must run or she won't survive. She runs. It's a tough track. She at the end of her rope, starving and thinking of resorting to cannibalism, and the story continues. Ahead of her, on a slight rise of ground where a side stream came in from the north, a body lay prone in the air about a dozen feet above ground. She stopped dead in her tracks. She was at last truly seeing things. She had come to the end of her rope. Her brain had snapped. She fastened all of her attention on it. Her eyes went over the apparition piece by piece. She stood slightly humped over, trying to ride out the blow, the shock of knowing she had gone insane. At last, staring hotly, she saw it wasn't an apparition after all, that it was actually an Indian wrapped in a buffalo robe. The Indian lay on some kind of platform. 4 posts supported it. It was an Indian burial out on the plains. An honored chief of some sort lay on the scaffold. She approached it warily, looking up at it. She wondered if relatives had left food behind to sustain the chief on his long journey down the Spirit Road. She hoped so. She could use the food better than a dead body could. Then she began to wonder how fresh the body was. If it was only a day or so old, she could have herself a broiled arm. She stood under it. She shook the post supporting it. A gourd made a belling noise. She shook the scaffold again. A piece of buffalo fur slipped open on one side, and out rolled a white skull. The skull fell with a light thump at her feet. She looked at the weathered skull with regret. No meat there. A voice suddenly sounded behind her, a familiar voice. I see what the white woman feels. I see that the white woman feels sad. I want to shake hands with her. That is all I have to say. Judith turned slowly, not wanting to see what she knew she was going to see, Scarlet Plume. He was holding out a hand to her. There was a warm, grave smile on his wide, dark face. The usual yellow dot inside the blue circle lay on his left cheekbone. She also saw something else. It made her wild inside. He was wearing a creamy wolfskin over his shoulders, the same wolfskin she had left behind in the brown cabin in Sioux Falls. Numbly, she realized he had been following her all along. He was the gray shape that had been haunting her. Thank you, Frederick. You have done a wonderful job with a woman. Thank you. Writing about a woman.
Our next reader is Peter Campion. He is the author of 2 books of poems, Other People from 2005 and The Lions, 2009. And they're both from the University of Chicago Press. He's the recipient of the Pushcart Prize, the Larry Levis or Reading Prize, the Prix de Rome from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He teaches at the University of Minnesota, and he lives in Minneapolis. I think he's fairly recent here. I also think that he's very modest because he writes very tiny bios for himself. Here he comes.
Thank you, Freya. It's my good fortune to be able to read from this novel, Lord Grizzly. I thought that everybody else would have requested it first, but they didn't. I'm going to read very briefly. In this scene, the protagonist, Hugh Glass, who's a frontiersman, a trapper, has been mauled by a grizzly bear, a mother grizzly, so she has a pretty good motive. And he survives. He's left for dead. And in this passage, at the beginning of the second book, which is called The Crawl, because he proceeds to crawl 200 miles, at the beginning of this book, he realizes he's still alive. And I think you'll hear some of that tone in the way that the sentences, the syntax and the diction, the phrasing, register the very feeling of consciousness, what it feels like to know you're alive. A cold nose woke him. He tried opening his eyes, couldn't. Found his eyelids crusted shut. He blinked hard a few times, still couldn't open them. Gave up. The back of his head ached like a stone cracking in heat. His entire back, from high in his neck and across his shoulder blades and through the small of his back and deep into his buttocks, was a slate of tight pain. The cracking ache and the tight pain were too much. He drifted off into gray sleep. The cold nose woke him again. And again he rose up out of gray into whimmering pink consciousness. He blinked hard once, twice, still couldn't quite uncrack his crusted eyelids. A dog licking his face? Dogs never licked bearded faces that he remembered. The cold nose touched him once more on the brow, and then he knew he wasn't being licked in love. He was being sniffed over. Hugh concentrated on his crusted eyes, forced all he had into opening them, and after a supreme effort, the stuck lashes parted with little crust-breaking sounds. Blue instantly flooded into his old gray eyes. There was an unusually clear sky overhead. Yellow light was striking up into blue. That meant it was morning. If rust and pink had been sinking away under blue-black, it would have been late afternoon. Also, a few birds were chirping a little. That proved it was morning. Birds never chirped in the late afternoon in August, at least not that he knew of. August? Where in tarnation? With a jerk, Hugh tried to sit up. The jerk liked to kill him. His whole back and his rump and his right leg, all three, became raging red monsters. He groaned. God! His whole chest rumbled with it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a bristling white-gray shape jump back. Sight of the jumping white-gray shape kept him from fainting. That white-gray, bristling shape had a cold black nose. It was a wolf. Then it all came back to him, what had happened and where he was. Major Henry had ordered him to shave off his beard. He had refused. Major Henry had then given the hunting detail to Allen and 2 other men. He'd got mad and gone off hunting by himself, only to run smack into a she-grizzly. Miraculously, he was still alive then.
Thank you so much to the readers. I'm enjoying them so much. We have 2 more readers, one on film and one in person. We have a very short film of Bill Home, and I don't even know how long I should spend introducing Bill. He wrote Coming Home Crazy, Box Elder Bug Variations, The Dead Get By With Everything. I think many of you certainly know him. He lived and worked in Minnesota much of his life, and his spirit, I think, remains everywhere, even here. So you'll see him reading at Blue Mound for a few minutes. A year after my father died, he's reading. And then his incredibly and very, very dear friend it will be coming up. And I want to introduce you at the same time, John, since you are so close with Bill. I might as well introduce both of you now. After Bill, you can follow. But John Calvin Wismerski is the person who put together, really, the Manfred Reader that is out. They have a few of them for sale outside now. But he works as a poet, he works as a writer, and he works as an editor. And he's written a screenplay, which I didn't know, and 3 plays, and 20 books and chapbooks, which include this Frederick Manfred Reader, but also Held for Questioning is one of his books, and What Do I Know is a book that he wrote, and Breaking the Rules, which a wonderful book. So he also bridges the gap between academic and community arts. He collaborates with artists and musicians and dancers and scientists, and he performs often on radio for audiences in theaters, schools, libraries, churches, parks, bars, and coffee houses, and so on. He taught writing also at Gustavus Adolphus College for 35 years, and he's had many honors, a National Endowment for the Arts honor, a term as a poet laureate of the League of Minnesota Poets. And this is interesting. He also is a member of the Utah Poetry Society, the Mosaic Theater, and the poetry performance group Lady Poetesses from Hell. But Bill will talk you a little bit on screen, and then we will meet John Resmersky.
I'll read a piece I read last year that I read many times in Fred's presence. When Fred, I knew Fred when I was in college. He spoke at Gustavus, and I drove down to Laverne, and I met him in this house when Fred was a young kid. But really, Fred and I became good friends after he had lost this house. And I remember spending a couple of days going around with him finding stones for his new house in the trunk of that old green Cadillac he had. God, he must have wrecked the shocks in that thing over and over and over. And Fred, like one of the things, his vitality remained so strong because there wasn't a nostalgic bone in Fred's body. He never forgot anything that happened to him. But he didn't have the kind of swampy nostalgia we've got now. Like, oh, it was better in the 30s. It was better in the 40s. It was better in the 50s. That was pure bull, and Fred knew it. The best day was the next day that you were alive and writing and thinking and something was happening to you. So he hung around young people. I remember him going on Poetry Out Loud tours with us and reading all over the state. One night we gave a reading in Laverne, and 3 of us were staying in the house, and I stayed in Maria's bedroom upstairs. And Fred had been downstairs, and as always, nobody got a word in edgewise, and I had asked him about various objects in the room. The house was just one room that he hadn't put on his addition. So I went upstairs that night, and I wrote this little description of Fred, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and it's still a good description of Fred. Fred Manfred in Roundwood, Laverne, Minnesota. He is a tall, thin beanpole of a man with a good shock of hair, blonde or gray, depending on the light falling on it. Sometimes he is over 60, sometimes in his 20s. He likes making low houses in tall places, to be higher than his own roof line, but not so high as the hill. Humility, too, should be practiced in moderation. Too much of it takes the spunk and life out of a man. But he does not talk moderately. No story is lost on him, so he rolls them around in his mouth like a good chew of snooze, occasionally spitting at the page to see how it falls, how the pattern looks. He invents books the same way he invents houses. Finding a hill or a rock wall, old lumber, black meteorites, red quartz, gray granite, liberated from a farmer's bean field and hauled home in the trunk of the old Cadillac. Things already there, but with no shape yet. He pulls at his beard, looks around to see where they can be piled up in an orderly way, and if after piling and mortaring, you might possibly live in them with some comfort and elegance. If one house is eaten by a steak or a bank or a woman, there are always more rocks and more bean fields, more hillsides to pile. On the wall of the house, a carved board with a Frisian sentence. Schuk, God is grat, and we begrippen him net. I gotta do this. Schuk, God is grat, and we begrippen him net. How does it sound in Frisian, I asked. He roars it with thunderclap consonants, sledgehammer vowels, throwing arms and fingers into the air. Suddenly, he is 11 feet tall. His leap is a cross between a ballet dancer, a basketball setter, and a 100-year-old fence post coming up out from hard ground on its own power. God is great, and we can't grip him around. You finish getting your hands on something, it's dead. That's Fred's wisdom, why he opens his hands so much, why nothing ever gets entirely done. That's true, nothing is done. Read the Golden Bowl.
What a wonderful thing it is to hear so many voices trying to capture and render Fred's voice. One of the things about Fred, people think about his voice, and he gets stereotyped a lot, you know. There are those people who, oh, Fred Manfred, isn't he the Western writer? Or he's the guy who writes those stories about life on a farm in Iowa. Oh, he's a guy who writes the stories about farm life in Iowa. And they think of his voice a lot of times as the voice of the characters that he represents. But he actually had a lot of voices, you know. He had a dozen different varieties of the home dialect around the place where he grew up and the other places where he grew up. He had a poetic voice, the sports writer's voice. A lot of people don't realize that he also wrote in a very scholarly manner some of the time, and that he had also a kind of an oratorical voice, which comes out in the passage that I'm going to read from, or some selected passages from his funeral oration for St. Clair Lewis, who had been a patron of his early in his career. And Fred was a guy who always believed in paying off his literary debts, paid it backward and paid it forward through his students, whom he was always a great encourager in his past. St. Clair Lewis, as I mentioned, and some other particular literary figures. You know, Fred was a great fan of Chaucer rather than Shakespeare, although he respected Shakespeare, of course, and younger writers like Tim O'Brien, Linda Hasselstrom, and others. But in this talk at St. Clair Lewis's funeral or memorial service, he has a message for all of us who write or try to write or want to write, and for readers as well. Much has been made of the theory that the American artist is lonely in America. And Lewis was lonely. When you smiled at him or indicated that you had some sense of his worth to you, both as friend and artist, he almost broke his back. Yeah, gave the shirt off his back even to be good to you. Up to a point.
because it wasn't long before Lewis's natural wary instincts warned him that he might be endangering both himself and his livelihood by keeping his hand open too long. He knew history, that it's full of instances of betrayal where Joseph's brothers turn on Joseph, where Saul turns on David, where Judas turns on Christ, where a friend turns on Edgar Allan Poe and forever leaves a blight on Poe's great fair name, where in the realm of human brotherhood, Englishman and Russian and American and Spaniard and Frenchman and Italian turn on each other with bared and knife-sharp teeth of destruction. Lewis knew. And it is with pity that one looks at the expatriates who think they have to go to the left bank in gay Paris or to eternal Rome to find their home, where they meet Parisian artists or Roman artists who have to go to America now to find their home. It is to the eternal credit of the manhood and of the artist in Sinclair Lewis that he tried most of his life to live in the country he was born in. Why couldn't he have written more sweetly, more comfortingly? Why? The psychiatrist or the analyst may perhaps tell you there was some unresolved hurt or some unsatisfied hunger suffered in youth, which harried and drove him to get psychic justice. The man of God may perhaps say that it was some hidden or inward or deep sense of guilt or sin in his conscience that drove him on. The critic, the social worker, the lawyer, the doctor, the politician, the relative, the friend, all will have their particular theories. And in a sense, all may be right. I have only a simple opinion. I like to think that he wrote what he did because somewhere, sometime there leaped into focus in Lewis two simultaneous visions, or knowledges, or insights. One of the way things ought to be. Two of the way things were. Lewis was an honest man and a man who loved justice. When he saw the vast, awful gulf that lay between the two knowledges, he was outraged. And a fire started in him that never went out, that harried him until he gave in to it and he had to take up pen and paper. Perhaps, maybe, possibly, we may someday know the mystery of the origin of these knowledges. These knowledges that cause men to take up medicine, the ministry, law, artistry, social work, palmistry, to take up all those many and varied missions which cause us to say of one, he has heard the call. Lewis heard the call too, not to preach or to admonish in particular, or to hurl unctuous maxims and hellfire anathemas at us, but the call to lift a light, a lamp, so that the rest of us could clear away the lies, the deceit, the sloth, the sins of omission and commission that beset us as humans. And not only that, but to lift the light so that we could see what it meant to be human. Lewis held up a flame to illuminate our way a little distance at the same time that he goaded us, even seared some of us into action, until we saw. This is the charge then. Do not, while you are admiring the vapor trails fading in the firmament, while you are lamenting these, his ashes, still warm at our feet, do not forget that Red Lewis was human and mortal and errorful. Do not forget that lights eventually burn out. Do not forget that someone must leap forward to grab up the torch, or else much that was human shall have been lost to darkness. And do not forget that any one of you and all of you are candidate torchbearers. Well, thanks to Fred for carrying the torch, and thanks to all of you for being candidate torchbearers.
Well, that's marvelous, John. Thank you again to the readers. Thank you so much. And we're going to conclude with a little film, beautiful little film that Gregory Winter has made. Gregory Winter is a outstanding cinematographer, 30 years of experience in the business. He's a partner and director, cinematographer with Blue 60 Pictures in Minneapolis. He's directed hundreds of commercials during his 20 years as a director, working with national clients such as Target and Best Buy and Kellogg's cereals. The first feature film he photographed, is called Detective Fiction, and it was admitted to the Sundance Film Festival. He's also photographed and directed Shared Sacrifice, Rock County in War with the Twin Cities Public TV, which was commissioned around the broadcast of Ken Burns' The War, and it was nominated for a regional Emmy. It's just a little short film, and to end our gathering, and I'll introduce Greg to come up and say something about it, if he will.
Thank you, Freya. I just wanted to give you guys just a little bit of insight into the film today. It was a combination of a couple of things. One was simply the documentary footage that was generated on the day of the memorial at Roundwind. And it was also then combined with some footage from another project I was working on at the time for the State Department of Tourism, which really just gave me a good excuse to go back down to Southwest Minnesota and be able to talk to people like Fred and Paul Gruco as well. When I looked at the film again this week, I wanted to say 4 things that struck me. One was, first of all, thanks to Freya for her poetry and her collaboration. We have collaborated on other things together as well since then. And also for inviting me to screen this movie with you today. I also want to thank Mike Hazard and Waring Jones, who's no longer with us, for making it possible that day to commiserate together at Roundwind and to record this necessary footage. I also wanted to say thank you today for the assembly that day at Roundwind in 1994, and also to say thanks for the natural embalming quality of photography. There are a lot of faces here today that will appreciate being able to see again. And finally, thanks to Fred, who set an example of a creative life for an inspiring young artist growing up in Laverne.
It's definitely true that the person that would have enjoyed this day the most is the one that's not here. This is called My Father by the Fire. And it was written in February of '94 after we'd visited him and after Uncle Ed had died. He's 82. He splits and hauls the logs and sets the fire himself. First, crumbled newspaper, stacked like baseballs beneath the kindling. Then the first log, pine is good, set far back, and the second log in front of it with 3 or 4 oak logs on top, space to leave room for air. Then open the flue so the wood catches fire in a vacuum, led by a thin trail of smoke fleeing to the sky. Or did his eyes start the fire without matches, those bolts of blue lightning in the old white thunderhead?
His garden-stained shirt's too small. Old pants hang from his bony knees. and he's given up trying to straighten his back even after he stands. Bones, flesh, skin, hair, worn thin by rivers of the sky roaring past. He doesn't remember what we said last week, but his forgetfulness is a stone that absorbs and holds the sun one day at a time. If he goes, I'm wind. I'm on the road again. No more blue coffee cups on a homemade table. I'll be traveling a long way for a laugh. If he goes, will I remember how to make a fire? Throbbing red coals beckon us into the fertile black and red and yellow forest where wild animals open their blazing lava eyes, flex their claws, spit, lash their tails, each fire laid exactly the same, each aroused from slumber with one match, saying everything that matters to the father and his daughter.
We are crouched here together in the wild storm, but we are warm, and we are home.
Well, I feel incredibly lucky to have spent my afternoon this way. Thank you to all of the readers for putting together such a beautiful program. Thank you, Freya, especially. This was very wonderful. I invite all of you to join us in the atrium for an ice cream social. We will be playing Mike Hazard's film American Grizzly during the reception as well, and please feel free to visit some of the archives of the Frederick Manfred papers from the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. I only ask you to leave your ice cream and coffee on that side of the room when you're looking at the papers on that side, so we can look at them for many hundreds of years more. So there will be a 200th birthday, a 300th birthday, and on. So thank you. Thank you very much.